I received your new Dad 1 master prompt and title single dad rescued a female CEO in a snowstorm. Then his daughter revealed mom's secret. I'll follow the 9-part Just Dad Things outline structure. Use fresh American names, remove slow, boring points, and make the story more dramatic and emotional. Title: Single Dad Rescued a Female CEO in a Snowstorm. Then his daughter revealed mom's secret. The snowstorm swallowed the road like it wanted to erase it. Outside the small mountain town of Briar Creek, Montana, Mason Reed gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup with cracked, oil-stained hands. The wipers fought hard against the white blur, but the snow kept coming, slamming against the windshield like handfuls of broken glass. In the back seat, his little daughter, Ava, slept under a faded quilt, her arms wrapped tightly around the stuffed rabbit her mother had given her before the hospital took her away for the last time. Mason had just finished a brutal double shift at Harlan's Auto Repair. His body ached. His eyes burned. All he wanted was to get Ava home, start the wood stove, and pretend for one quiet night that the world was not falling apart. Then he saw the hazard lights. A black luxury SUV sat half buried in a ditch near the bend, its rear tires swallowed by snow, its front end tilted toward the trees. Mason almost drove past before something inside him pulled him back. He stepped into the storm and found a woman trapped inside, soaked, shaking, and barely able to speak. She wore a ruined designer coat, one broken heel, and the kind of fear money could not hide. Mason dragged her out seconds before a heavy pine branch crashed down across the hood. By morning, the stranger was standing in his kitchen, wearing his flannel shirt, helping Ava make pancakes shaped like little stars. Then Ava looked up at Mason with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Daddy, I told her Mommy's secret last night." Mason's heart stopped. Subscribe to Just Dad Things for more powerful single dad stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Here is Part 2, no heading, stronger emotional words, deeper Dad 1 style feeling, and more cinematic pacing. Before the storm brought a stranger to his door, Mason Reed's whole life had become a careful routine of holding broken things together. He lived with his 6-year-old daughter, Ava, in a rented cabin outside Briar Creek, tucked between dark pine trees and a narrow road that disappeared under snow every winter. From the outside, the place looked peaceful. Smoke curled from the chimney. A porch light glowed at night. Ava's little boots sat beside Mason's work boots near the door. But inside, Mason knew the truth. The roof leaked near the back porch whenever the wind pushed rain sideways. The furnace coughed and rattled before it gave any heat. One kitchen cabinet hung crooked because Mason had fixed it 3 times and still had not found the money to replace the hinge. A toolbox stayed beside the door like part of the furniture because, in Mason's life, something was always loose, cracked, late, or close to falling apart. He had not always lived this way. Years ago, Mason had a plan. He and his wife, Grace, used to sit at the kitchen table after Ava fell asleep and talk about opening their own repair shop. Mason would run the garage. Grace would handle the books, paint the sign, and tell him when he was being too stubborn to ask for help. They had even picked a name for it: Reed Family Auto. Mason could still hear Grace laughing when she said it sounded too official for a man who kept receipts in an old coffee can. Then Grace got sick. At first, Mason told himself they would beat it. He worked extra hours. He drove her to appointments. He slept in hospital chairs with his boots still on. He learned the smell of antiseptic, the sound of machines, and the terrible silence that comes when doctors stop making promises. The savings disappeared first. Then the dream disappeared. Then Grace did. After that, Mason stopped thinking about the future. The future felt greedy. The future felt like something only people with full bank accounts and unbroken families were allowed to have. so he made his world smaller. Wake up, feed Ava, work, pay what he could, fix what broke, keep going. Ava was the only reason he did. She was the softest part of his life and the heaviest weight on his heart. 6 years old, with wide brown eyes, tangled morning hair, and a way of noticing things adults tried to hide. Before Grace died, Ava had been sunshine in a pink jacket. She sang in the bathtub. She danced in the grocery aisle. She drew pictures of 3 people holding hands under a yellow sun. After the funeral, the colors changed. Ava stopped singing first. Then she stopped asking for bedtime stories. Then she started drawing houses with one dark window, or dinner tables with one empty chair, or 3 people where one face was left blank. Mason kept every drawing in a folder because throwing them away felt cruel, but looking at them felt like being punished. Some nights he would stand outside Ava's bedroom door and listen to her whisper to the stuffed rabbit Grace had given her, "Tell Mommy I was good today." Those words broke him in places he did not know a man could break. Mason carried guilt like another coat on his shoulders. He felt guilty for not saving Grace, guilty for working too much, guilty when Ava ate boxed macaroni for dinner 3 nights in 1 week, guilty when he was too tired to answer her questions with the patience she deserved, guilty for the cedar memory box still sitting in the closet, untouched. Grace had left letters in that box. Some were labeled for birthdays, some for hard days. One envelope had Mason's name on it in Grace's careful handwriting, but he had never opened it. He told himself he was saving it for the right time. The truth was simpler and more painful. He was afraid of what she might say. Every morning before sunrise, Mason moved quietly through the cabin so he would not wake Ava too early. He packed her lunch, checked the truck's tires, scraped ice from the windshield, and drove her to Mrs. Calloway's home daycare on his way to Harlan's auto repair. Then he spent the day under hoods and trucks, breathing cold air and motor oil, his hands splitting at the knuckles from grease, metal, and winter. By evening, he came home with sore shoulders, unpaid worries, and just enough energy left to smile when Ava looked at him. Money was always a shadow in the room. The rent was behind. The power bill was waiting. The landlord had been kind so far, but Mason knew kindness had limits when money was involved. The worst fear was not losing the cabin itself. It was what losing the cabin might prove to everyone watching, especially Marlene. Grace's older sister, Marlene Whitaker, loved Ava in her own sharp, worried way. She did not think Mason was a bad father. That almost made it worse. She thought he was tired, poor, alone, one emergency away from failing. She had already mentioned more than once that Ava could stay with her just until things settled. Mason hated those words, just until, because men like Mason knew how temporary things became permanent when they had no money to fight back. That was why the woman sleeping on his couch made him uneasy. Natalie, that was the name she had given him, though Mason could tell she had given him as little as possible. Her coat was ruined, but expensive. Her watch looked worth more than his truck. Even asleep, she held herself like someone trained never to look helpless. She had not asked for much, but her silence had weight. Trouble had followed her through that storm, and Mason could feel it standing outside his door. He did not want trouble near Ava. He did not want strangers in the cabin. He did not want questions from Marlene, gossip from town, or some rich woman's problems spilling into the fragile life he was barely protecting. But then Ava walked into the kitchen and saw Natalie wrapped in Mason's old flannel shirt. And instead of hiding behind his leg, Ava smiled. It was not a big smile, not the bright, fearless smile she used to have before hospitals in black dresses and whispered condolences. It was small, careful, almost unsure of itself, but it was real. Mason stood in the doorway, coffee forgotten in his hand, watching his daughter sit beside this stranger at the table. Ava showed Natalie her stuffed rabbit. Natalie listened like it mattered. Ava asked if grown-ups could still be lost even when they had maps. Natalie looked down at the little girl, and something sad moved across her face. "Sometimes," she said softly. "Especially then." Ava nodded like she understood. Mason's chest tightened. For 2 years he had tried everything: pancakes, bedtime stories, new crayons, old songs, trips to the frozen pond. He had tried to pull laughter out of the silence with both hands, and still, grief had kept Ava just out of reach. But this stranger, this woman with secrets in her eyes and danger at her back, had somehow opened a tiny door. Mason should have been relieved. Instead, he was scared, because in his life, good things did not arrive without a cost. Warmth did not come without winter behind it. And as he watched Ava lean closer to Natalie, whispering something he could not hear, Mason felt the first dangerous flicker of hope. The kind of hope that could save a broken home, or destroy what little he had left. Here is asterisk part 3, rewritten with asterisk no heading, asterisk read mine, tension, and more cinematic Dad One style emotion. For a few quiet minutes, Mason Reed almost let himself believe the morning could stay simple. The storm still pressed against the windows, but inside the cabin there was warmth. The wood stove cracked softly. Buck, the old dog, slept near the rug with one ear twitching. Ava sat at the kitchen table with flour on her cheek, carefully arranging pancake stars on a chipped blue plate like she was building a tiny sky. And Natalie stood beside the stove in Mason's old flannel shirt, sleeves rolled over her delicate wrists, her damp hair falling loose around her face. She looked nothing like the woman he had dragged from that wrecked SUV the night before. She looked softer now, almost ordinary, almost safe. But Mason had spent too many years fixing broken machines and reading people who tried to hide the real problem under the surface. Natalie Hart was not ordinary. Everything about her was too careful. The way she held her coffee with both hands but barely drank it, the way her eyes kept drifting toward the driveway, the way her shoulders tightened every time the wind shook the walls. She thanked Mason again for saving her life, but even her gratitude sounded guarded, like she was afraid one honest sentence might reveal too much. Mason leaned against the counter, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Someone looking for you?" he asked. Natalie's hand tightened around the mug. For a moment, she said nothing. The only sound was the stove popping and Ava softly humming over her pancakes. Then Natalie looked toward the front window and whispered, "Too many people." That was when Mason knew. She had not just gotten lost in the storm. She had been running from something. Before he could ask another question, Buck lifted his head and growled. Ava stopped humming. Mason turned toward the window and saw headlights crawling slowly through the white morning like two pale eyes. A black corporate SUV rolled up the long driveway, its tires cutting deep tracks through the snow. It stopped near the porch, too clean, too expensive, too out of place beside Mason's battered pickup and the woodpile stacked under a tarp. Natalie went completely still. All the little color that had returned to her face disappeared. Mason stepped away from the counter. "You know them." Natalie did not answer, but she did not have to. The SUV doors opened. A tall man in a dark wool coat stepped out first, carrying himself like the weather was supposed to apologize for touching him. Behind him came a woman with sharp eyes, perfect hair, and a leather folder tucked against her chest. Neither of them looked at the cabin with curiosity. They looked at it like a problem that needed to be cleaned up. Mason opened the door before they could knock. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of snow, exhaust, and expensive cologne. The man looked Mason up and down, taking in the worn jeans, the faded thermal shirt, the cracked hands, the tired eyes. His expression did not change, but Mason felt the judgment land anyway. "Mason Reed?" the man asked. "That depends who's asking." The man's smile was thin. Calvin Rhodes, Chief Legal Officer for Hartwell Horizons. The woman beside him stepped forward. Bianca Vale, Public Relations. Hartwell Horizons. Mason had heard the name before. Everyone had. The company owned luxury lodges, mountain resorts, family retreats, and polished vacation properties across half the country. Their ads were always on television at Christmas. Smiling families by fireplaces. Perfect children in matching pajamas. Couples laughing under soft lights. Their slogan was printed everywhere. Building places where people belong. Mason looked back at Natalie. Only then did the pieces begin to click into place. Natalie Hart. Not just Natalie. The Natalie Hart. Chief Executive Officer of Hartwell Horizons. A woman whose face had been on magazine covers and grocery store checkout lines. A woman who built million-dollar places where strangers felt welcome while standing in Mason's kitchen like she had nowhere in the world she could safely breathe. Calvin stepped past Mason's shoulder, trying to look inside. Ms. Hart, thank God. The board has been waiting all night. The press conference has been delayed twice. We need to move before this becomes worse. Natalie did not move. Bianca opened the leather folder as if paper could command a person better than kindness. The official statement is ready. We are saying you became overwhelmed by the storm conditions and were taken in by a local resident. Nothing alarming. Nothing damaging. Damaging, Mason repeated quietly. Bianca glanced at him as if she had forgotten he could speak. Calvin's voice stayed smooth. Mr. Reed, we appreciate your assistance. Hartwell Horizons will compensate you for your trouble. Mason felt something in his jaw tighten. Before he could answer, Ava slid off her chair and came to stand near his leg. Her little fingers curled into the fabric of his jeans. Natalie saw it. So did Calvin. His expression softened in a fake way that made Mason dislike him immediately. And this must be your daughter, Calvin said. Very sweet, but Miss Hart needs to return to where she belongs. Ava looked up at him with flowers still on her cheek. But what if she was sad there? The room went silent. Calvin blinked, caught off guard by the kind of question no lawyer could polish away. Natalie's eyes filled, but she lowered them quickly. Mason placed one steady hand on Ava's shoulder. He could feel her small body leaning against him, trusting him to understand what she had just understood before any adult had dared to say it. Bianca cleared her throat. Ms. Hart, this situation is already complicated. Preston is extremely concerned. At that name, Natalie's face changed again. Mason noticed. Preston? He asked. Calvin answered for her. Preston Vale, a principal investor. Ms. Hart's fiancé. Natalie lifted her head. Her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the room. I never said yes. Bianca's lips pressed together. Calvin looked irritated, not surprised. That told Mason everything. The announcement Natalie had run from was not just business. It was a cage dressed up as celebration, a merger wrapped in flowers. A woman's silence turned into permission by people who needed her name, her company, and her future to stay useful. For the first time, Mason saw the real shape of her fear. Natalie was powerful, but surrounded. She had money, lawyers, headlines, and helicopters waiting somewhere beyond the storm. But inside his little cabin, wearing his flannel shirt and standing near his daughter's pancake plate, she looked less like a CEO and more like someone who had spent years being managed by people who never once asked if she was happy. Calvin turned back to Mason. Mr. Reed, this is a corporate matter. We do not want unnecessary interference. Mason gave a dry, humorless laugh. Ava looked up at him. He stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the cold from reaching the kitchen. The road is iced over, Mason said. The storm is not finished. Nobody is dragging anyone out of my house because a boardroom is impatient. Calvin's eyes narrowed. "You should be careful. There may be legal consequences if you obstruct." "This is not a boardroom," Mason said, his voice calm but firm. "It is my home." The words landed harder than shouting would have. For a second no one moved. Then Mason looked at Natalie, not like she was famous, not like she was rich, not like she owed him anything. He looked at her like she still had the right to choose. And for the first time since she had opened her eyes in that cabin, Natalie Hart looked at Mason Reed as if she was seeing more than a poor mechanic with a leaking roof. She was seeing a man who had almost nothing, and still refused to let powerful people take what was not theirs. Here is Part 4's rewritten with no heading stronger emotional pacing and more cinematic Dad 1 style detail. The lights went out just after noon. One moment, the cabin was filled with the low hum of the old refrigerator and the soft crackle of the wood stove. The next, everything snapped into darkness. The furnace died with a tired groan. The kitchen clock stopped ticking. The wind outside hit the windows so hard the glass trembled in its frame. Ava gasped and grabbed Mason's sleeve. Buck lifted his head from the rug and let out a nervous whine. Natalie stood near the sink, frozen in the sudden dimness, her face half lit by the gray stormlight pushing through the curtains. For a second, Mason saw something flash across her eyes. Not simple fear, something deeper, the look of a woman who had spent too much of her life trapped in rooms where everyone else held the key. "It's okay," Mason said, his voice low and steady. He said it for Ava first. Then, maybe for Natalie too. He did not rush. He did not curse. He did not act like the world was ending, even though one more broken thing was the last thing he needed. He moved through the cabin like a man who had learned long ago that panic never fixed anything. He lit the wood stove higher, feeding it split logs from the stack by the door. He checked the old flashlight in the drawer and handed it to Ava. "Important job," he told her. "You count the batteries and tell me which ones still work." Ava blinked up at him, still scared. "Like a helper?" she asked. "Like the boss of emergency lights." That made her sit a little straighter. Mason set candles on the counter, high enough where Ava could not bump them, far enough from curtains and paper towels. He wedged an old towel beneath the drafty kitchen door. Then he pulled a plastic bin from the hall closet and handed Natalie a pair of thick wool socks and an emergency blanket. Natalie stared at the socks like no one had offered her something that practical in years. "You keep all this ready?" she asked. Mason shrugged, already moving toward the back hall. "Out here, you either prepare or you apologize to your kid while she shivers." There was no pride in the answer, no performance, just truth. Natalie watched him work. In her life, emergencies were handled by other people. Assistants made calls. Lawyers prepared statements. Security teams rerouted cars. Public relations wrote careful sentences to make disasters sound smaller than they were. Problems arrived in polished folders and left through expensive doors. But Mason handled a crisis with a flashlight, a towel, cracked hands, and a calm voice. He did not have a team. He had Ava. So he became the team. The storm kept climbing. Snow pressed against the windows, wind howled down the chimney. Somewhere outside, a tree groaned under the weight of ice. Then Ava coughed. At first it was small, a quick, sharp sound from the table where she was lining up batteries in 2 uneven rows. Mason turned immediately. Ava coughed again. This time her little shoulders pulled tight. Mason's entire body changed. Not with panic, but with recognition. "Ava," he said gently, "look at me, sweetheart." She tried to answer, but another cough caught in her chest. Her eyes widened, frightened by her own breathing. Natalie stepped forward. "What's wrong?" "Cold air and stress," Mason said, already opening the kitchen drawer. Her lungs get tight sometimes. His voice stayed calm, but Natalie saw the fear behind it. It was there in the quick way his fingers searched for the inhaler, in the way his jaw locked, in the way he lowered himself beside Ava so she would not have to look up at him and feel small. He wrapped a warm towel around her shoulders, sat her upright, and placed the inhaler in her hand. "Slow with me," he whispered, "just like we practiced. In through the nose if you can. Out like you're cooling soup." Ava's lower lip trembled. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Mason said. "I'm right here. You don't have to do it alone." Natalie stood helpless for a moment, holding the emergency blanket against her chest. She was used to commanding rooms full of adults, signing papers that moved millions of dollars, and making decisions people praised in newspapers. But here, beside a frightened little girl struggling for breath, all that power meant nothing. Mason did not ask Natalie for anything grand. He only nodded toward the stove. "Hold that towel near the heat for a second. Not too close." Natalie obeyed immediately. Mason helped Ava take the inhaler. He counted softly, not with numbers that felt clinical, but with steady words. "Good. Again. That's my brave girl. Stay with Daddy." Ava's breathing slowly loosened. The color returned to her cheeks. Mason did not relax until she leaned against him and whispered, "I'm okay." Only then did his eyes close for half a second. Natalie saw it. The fear he had swallowed. The terror he had hidden so Ava would not have to carry it. That was when something inside Natalie shifted. She had met powerful men, rich men, men who owned buildings, controlled boards, and made rooms bend around them. But she had never seen strength like this. Quiet strength, tired strength, the kind that did not need applause because a child's next breath was the only reward that mattered. Ava looked toward Natalie and patted the chair beside her. "Can you sit here?" Natalie sat without hesitation. Ava reached for the old blue scarf folded over the back of a chair. The fabric was soft from years of use, a little faded at the edges, and smelled faintly of cedar from the memory box where Mason usually kept Grace's things. "This was Mommy's," Ava said, placing it carefully in Natalie's lap. "She wore it when the house felt too sad." Natalie's fingers closed around the scarf. For a moment, she could not speak. People had handed Natalie contracts, flowers, microphones, awards, and diamond jewelry chosen for photographs. They had asked for her signature, her statement, her smile, her loyalty, her silence. But this child had given her something no one in her world ever offered. Comfort without a price. Trust without a condition. Mason watched from the stove, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened when Ava rested her head against Natalie's arm. Later, when Ava was settled under a blanket near the fire, Mason pulled on his coat. "Generators probably iced up," he said. Natalie stood. "I'm coming with you." Mason looked at her. "You don't have to prove anything." She lifted her chin, though her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Maybe I do." Outside, the cold hit them like a wall. Snow whipped across the yard, stinging their faces. Mason led the way to the small generator shed near the woodpile, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a lantern in the other. Natalie held the flashlight, her fingers stiff inside gloves that were too big for her. Mason did not mock her when she struggled. He did not treat her like a helpless rich woman. He simply showed her where to aim the light, how to brace the shed door against the wind, and how to keep her foot away from the frozen fuel line. When she slipped on a patch of ice, Mason caught her by the arm. Not tightly, not possessively, just enough to keep her from falling. "You hurt?" he asked. Natalie looked at him, surprised by how simple the question was. No teasing, no charm, no advantage taken from the moment. Just concern. "No," she said softly. "I'm okay." "Good. Hold the light right there." And somehow that respect touched her more deeply than any compliment could have. A few minutes later, the generator coughed, sputtered, and finally roared alive. The cabin lights flickered through the storm-dark windows. Inside, Ava cheered. Mason's mouth curved into the smallest smile. It was gone almost as soon as it came, but Natalie saw it. She saw the man beneath the grief. The man Grace must have loved. The man Ava still needed. The man who had forgotten he was allowed to be more than tired. When they returned inside, Natalie's phone finally caught a weak signal. It buzzed in her hand. The name on the screen made her face tighten. Preston Vale. She almost did not answer, but the phone kept ringing like a command. When she put it to her ear, Preston's voice slipped through the quiet kitchen, smooth and cold enough for Mason to understand even without hearing every word. He told her the press had been handled. He told her the company was concerned. He told her the engagement announcement would still move forward when she returned. He told her people would forgive her little disappearance if she came back quietly. Natalie said nothing. Her silence filled the room like smoke. After the call ended, she stood there with Grace's scarf still around her shoulders and Mason's flannel hanging loose on her frame. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just fear wearing a nicer coat." Natalie's eyes lifted to his. The words struck something she had spent years trying not to name. Because he was right. And the worst part was, he had seen it without needing her title, her money, or her history. He had only needed to see her. Here is Part 5 rewritten with no heading, stronger drama, deeper humiliation, and better Dad 1 style emotional escalation. By the next morning, the storm had finally loosened its grip on Briar Creek, but the trouble around Mason Reed's cabin had only grown sharper. The snow outside no longer screamed against the windows. It fell softer now, drifting from the gray sky in slow, heavy flakes. The kind of snow that made the world look peaceful if a person did not know what waited underneath it. Inside the cabin, Ava sat cross-legged on the rug beside Buck, coloring quietly with her stuffed rabbit tucked against her knee. The wood stove burned low. Mason stood near the sink, pouring coffee he could barely afford to waste, while Natalie stared at her phone like it had just betrayed her. Her face had gone white. Mason noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Natalie did not answer at first. She only turned the screen toward him. A news alert filled the top of the page. Hartwell CEO safe after reported breakdown. Engagement to Preston Vale still moving forward. Mason read the line once, then again. The words were clean, polished, and cruel. They made Natalie sound fragile, unstable, like a woman who had wandered into a storm because she could not handle her own life. The article praised Preston Vale for standing by her during a difficult emotional episode. It said Hartwell Horizons was protecting her privacy. It said the engagement remained a joyful step forward for both families and for the company's future. Natalie let out a small, bitter laugh. "They wrote my life without me." Mason looked at her. "Then you need to correct it." She shook her head, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I have spent my whole life correcting people. They only hear the version that benefits them." There was no anger in her voice now. That was what made it worse. She sounded tired in a way Mason understood too well. Not sleepy, not weak. Tired from pushing against walls that never moved. Before Mason could answer, his own phone rang. "Harlan." Mason stepped into the hall and answered, already knowing from the tightness in his stomach that it would not be good. His boss did not waste time. A major repair appointment had been missed during the storm. A customer was angry. The shop was backed up. Harlan said he understood the roads were bad, but he also had a business to run. Mason tried to explain about the wreck, about the power outage, about Ava. But every word sounded like an excuse even when it was the truth. By the end of the call, Harlan said Mason's hours might be cut for the week. Might. That one word hit harder than a door slamming. Mason stood there with the phone in his hand, staring at the worn floorboards beneath his boots. One missed week of hours could mean the rent slipped further behind. It could mean another uncomfortable conversation with the landlord. It could mean Marlene hearing about it and deciding that concern gave her the right to step in. He rubbed a hand over his face and walked back into the kitchen. Natalie saw the look on him. Bad? Work, Mason said. Nothing I can't handle. But that was the lie poor fathers told because the truth sounded too close to begging. Then the phone rang again. This time, it was Marlene Whitaker. Mason's chest tightened before he even answered. Marlene's voice came through sharp with worry. She had heard from someone in town that Mason had brought an unknown woman into the cabin while Ava was home. She had heard there were corporate vehicles in his driveway. She had heard enough pieces of the story to build a version that made him look reckless. "Mason, I know you mean well," she said, and those words already hurt. "But Ava has been through enough. You cannot let strangers and trouble come in and out of her life." Mason kept his voice controlled. "I pulled a woman out of a wreck in a snowstorm. I was not going to leave her to freeze." "I am not saying you should have left her," Marlene replied. "I am saying judgment matters. Stability matters." There it was. Stability. The word everyone used when they wanted to remind Mason that love was not always enough in the eyes of the world. He looked toward Ava, who was coloring Buck with a purple crayon because she said dogs should get to be magical sometimes. His throat tightened. "I know what matters," Mason said quietly. After he hung up, the cabin felt smaller. Natalie stood near the stove, Grace's blue scarf still around her shoulders, guilt written across her face. "I should go," she said. Mason did not answer quickly enough. That silence hurt her more than he intended. Before either of them could speak, Buck rose again and growled toward the front door. Mason looked out the window. 3 vehicles were coming up the driveway. A black SUV, a second dark sedan, and behind them a county deputy's cruiser moving slowly over the packed snow. Natalie's face hardened. "Preston," she whispered. The vehicles stopped near the porch. The first man out looked like he had dressed for a photograph, not a winter road. Preston Vale wore a dark wool coat, polished shoes, leather gloves, and a smile so smooth it felt sharpened. Calvin Rhodes stepped out behind him. The deputy followed more slowly, looking uncomfortable, like a man who had been told only half the story. Mason opened the door before they knocked. Preston's smile widened. "Mr. Reed," he said warmly, as if they were old friends, "I owe you a sincere thank you for hosting Natalie during a confusing episode." Mason did not move aside. "She can speak for herself." Preston's eyes flicked past him toward Natalie, then returned to Mason with polite dismissal. "Of course, but stressful situations can cloud judgment." Natalie stepped into view. "My judgment is fine." Preston looked at her, and for the first time Mason saw what control looked like when it wore kindness as a mask. "Natalie," Preston said softly, "everyone is worried about you." "No," she replied. "Everyone is worried about what I might say." The deputy shifted on the porch. Calvin cleared his throat. "There was a welfare concern. Given the circumstances, we thought it best to make sure everyone here was safe." Mason almost laughed. A welfare concern. That was what money did when it wanted to enter a poor man's home without admitting. It was forcing the door open. Ava appeared at the hallway entrance with one of her drawings pressed against her chest. Her eyes moved from Preston to the deputy, then to Mason. Mason's voice softened immediately. "It's okay, sweetheart. Stay back." Preston noticed her and changed his face into something gentler. "And who is this little one?" Ava did not answer. She stepped behind Mason's leg, clutching the drawing tighter. Smart girl, Mason thought. Preston's gaze moved to Natalie, then to the blue scarf around her shoulders, then to Mason's flannel hanging near the stove. Something ugly flickered beneath his smile. "I see," Preston said. "Playing house with strangers now?" Mason's jaw tightened. Natalie's eyes flashed. "Careful," but Preston had already turned the blade. "I suppose I understand the appeal," he continued, looking around the worn cabin. "No cameras, no board, no responsibilities. Just a little escape with people who do not know what is at stake." Mason felt Ava's fingers dig into his jeans. That was what stopped him from stepping forward. He would not let his daughter see him become the kind of man Preston expected him to be. Preston reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He held it toward Mason. "For your trouble," he said. "A generous thank you, enough to make any inconvenience disappear." Mason stared at the envelope. The kitchen went silent. Natalie looked horrified. The deputy looked away. Calvin pretended to study the floor. Mason did not touch it. "No," Preston's smile did not fade. It only changed. "Men like you usually refuse once," he said quietly. "Then they ask how much." The words landed in front of Ava. That was the cruelty of it, not the money, not the insult. The fact that Preston had measured Mason in the same room where his daughter stood, reducing him to an empty wallet, a desperate father, a man who could be bought if the number was high enough. Mason felt shame rise hot in his chest, though he had done nothing wrong, because poverty made insults stick even when they were lies. Natalie stepped forward. "Get out." Preston looked at her, irritated now. "If you embarrass the company, the board will question your ability to lead. If you create a public scandal, they will question your stability. And if this situation becomes uglier, people may start asking why a little girl was kept in a cabin with a runaway executive and a man who clearly has problems of his own." Mason went still. There it was, not just a threat against Natalie, a threat against Ava, his home, his judgment, his right to be trusted with the child he had carried through grief, fever, nightmares, and every broken morning since Grace died. Natalie saw the color drain from his face. Ava saw it too, and something in the little girl broke open. She smiled, Ava said suddenly. Every adult turned toward her. Ava stepped out from behind Mason, trembling but brave, her drawing shaking in her hands. "Mommy said if somebody made me smile again, Daddy wasn't supposed to be scared." Mason's breath disappeared. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. Preston looked annoyed, as if the child had interrupted a negotiation. Ava looked up at her father, her small face wet now. "I told Natalie Mommy's secret because she looked sad, and because I smiled. I really did." Mason could not speak. The secret he had tried not to hear had finally stepped into the room, wearing Ava's voice. Before anyone could stop her, Ava ran down the hall and came back carrying the cedar memory box from the closet. It was too heavy for her, and Mason moved to help, but she shook her head with stubborn little determination. She opened it with shaking fingers and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. Grace's handwriting was still there. "For the day our little girl laughs again." Mason stared at the words. The room, the storm, Preston, the deputy, Natalie, the whole cruel world seemed to fall away. For 2 years, Mason had avoided that box because he was afraid of what Grace might ask him to release. Now the letter sat in Ava's hands like a door he could no longer keep closed, and Mason Reed, the man who could fix almost anything with tools, grease, and patience, stood in the middle of his kitchen, unable to breathe. Here is asterisk part 6, rewritten, with asterisk no heading, asterisk, deeper emotion, stronger lowest point feeling, and more powerful Dad 1 style wording. After Preston Vale finally left, the cabin did not feel like home anymore. It still had the same wood stove glowing in the corner, the same worn kitchen table, the same little boots drying near the door, the same pencil marks on the wall where Mason had measured Ava's height every few months since she was old enough to stand still. But something had changed. The warmth had been stolen. Outside, the storm was fading into a pale gray afternoon. Snow slipped from the pine branches in soft clumps. The wind had quieted. The sky was beginning to clear over Briar Creek like the worst of the weather had passed. Inside Mason Reed's chest, the storm had only gotten worse. He stood by the front window long after the vehicles disappeared down the driveway. His hands were curled into fists at his sides, but there was no one left to fight. That was the cruel part. Preston had not needed to raise his voice or break anything. He had walked into Mason's home, smiled like a gentleman, and turned every fear Mason carried into a weapon. His poverty, his grief, his daughter's safety, his right to be trusted. Mason kept hearing Preston's words. Men like you usually refuse once. The insults should not have mattered. Mason knew who he was. He knew he had pulled Natalie from a wreck because leaving her there would have been wrong. He knew he had refused the money because his dignity was not for sale. But shame did not always care about truth. Sometimes shame crawled in through the cracks, poverty left behind. Natalie stood near the stove, Grace's blue scarf still around her shoulders, looking like she wanted to apologize for every powerful person who had ever mistaken kindness for weakness. "Mason," she said softly. He did not turn around. If he looked at her, he was afraid she would see how badly Preston had hit him without ever touching him. Ava sat at the table with Grace's letter in front of her, both hands folded around the sealed envelope like she was guarding something holy. Her eyes moved between Mason and Natalie, too young to understand everything, but old enough to know when adults were scared. Then another car came up the driveway. Mason already knew before he saw her. Marlene Whitaker stepped out carefully into the snow, wrapped in a long dark coat, her face tight with worry. Grace's older sister had the same eyes Grace used to have, but where Grace's had been warm, Marlene's always looked like they were bracing for disaster. Mason opened the door. "Marlene," he said. She looked past him, saw Natalie, saw Ava, saw the deputy's tire tracks still carved into the snow outside, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. "I need to speak with you." Mason stepped onto the porch and pulled the door almost closed behind him, but not all the way. The cabin walls were thin. Ava would hear if voices rose. He knew that. Marlene knew it too. Her voice stayed low, but every word carried weight. "I got a call from someone in town. They said there were corporate people here. A deputy. A strange woman. Mason, what is going on? I helped someone who would have died in the storm." "I understand that," Marlene said, though her tone said she did not understand enough. "But Ava is not just any child. She is grieving. She is fragile. She does not need confusion. She does not need strangers becoming part of her life for one day and disappearing the next." Mason swallowed hard. "That is not what this is." "Do you know that?" Marlene asked. "Do you really know that? Because from where I am standing, this looks unstable." There was that word again. Unstable. It sounded cleaner than poor, kinder than failing, but Mason heard what lived underneath it. Not enough. Not safe enough. Not steady enough. Not the father Grace would have wanted if she had been here to choose. Marlene's face softened, but somehow that made it hurt more. "I am not your enemy," she said. "I loved my sister. I love Ava. I know you love her too. But love does not pay rent. Love does not stop powerful people from making trouble. Love does not protect a child from every reckless decision." Mason looked down at the porch boards. Snow had gathered near his boots. "I made the right decision," he said. but his voice sounded tired even to himself. Marlene's eyes filled with worry. Then why does it feel like Ava is the one who might pay for it? The words went straight through him. Behind the door, something small moved. Mason turned. Ava stood in the hallway, holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her face was pale. She had heard enough, maybe not every word, but enough to understand that adults were once again discussing where she belonged, as if home was something that could be voted on by people taller than her. "Ava," Mason said. She backed away. Then she ran to her room and shut the door. The sound was not loud. It still broke him. Mason stepped back into the cabin, past Marlene, past Natalie, past the kitchen table where Grace's unopened letter waited like a question he had spent 2 years refusing to answer. He wanted to be angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger gave a man something to hold. But what rose in him was worse than anger. Fear. The old, deep fear that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he loved Ava, no matter how many nights he stayed awake worrying over bills and coughs and nightmares, the world could still look at him and decide he was not enough. Marlene left after a few more quiet words, promising they would talk later. Mason barely heard them. When the door closed behind her, the cabin settled into a silence so heavy even Buck did not move. Mason sat at the kitchen table. Grace's letter lay in front of him. "For the day our little girl laughs again." His fingers hovered over the envelope, but he could not touch it. For years, he had told himself he was saving the letter for the right moment, for when he was ready, for some future version of himself who would know how to open his dead wife's handwriting without falling apart. But the truth had always been uglier. He was afraid Grace would release him, afraid she would tell him to live, afraid she would give him permission to love again, and then he would have no excuse left to hide behind grief. Natalie sat across from him, quiet, still wrapped in the blue scarf. The stormlight made her look softer and sadder, like the power and polish had been stripped away until only the woman remained. "I should leave," she said. Mason looked up. The words should have made sense. Natalie leaving would make things simpler. Preston would have less reason to come back. Marlene would calm down. Ava's life would stop being dragged into a world of lawyers, headlines, and rich men with threats hidden in their smiles. So Mason said the safest thing. Maybe that would be best. The moment the words left his mouth, he wished he could take them back. Natalie's face changed, not dramatically. She did not cry. She did not accuse him. She simply looked like someone who had been handed back to the cold after finally believing the door might stay open. "I am used to being moved around like a piece on someone else's board," she said quietly. "I just did not expect you to push me to." Mason's chest tightened. "I am not pushing you away. I am protecting Ava." Natalie looked toward the hallway where Ava had disappeared. Maybe Ava is the one who already understood what both of us were too scared to see. Mason stood so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. He found Ava in her bedroom. She had pulled her little backpack from the closet and was stuffing drawings inside with shaking hands. Her stuffed rabbit sat on the bed beside her. A sweater, a pair of socks, a photo of Grace, all the things a child gathered when she thought love might not be enough to keep her in one place. Mason felt the ground vanish beneath him. "Sweetheart," he whispered. Ava froze. Her voice came out small. "Is Aunt Marlene taking me away because I told Mommy's secret?" Mason dropped to his knees. "No, no, baby. Come here." She fell into his arms and he held her so tightly he was afraid he might break. Her little body shook against him. "I did not mean to make trouble," Ava cried. "I just wanted you to smile again. That was it." That was the thing that finally broke through the walls Mason had built around himself. Not Preston's threats. Not Marlene's fear. Not the bills. Not the shame. Ava's tiny voice, blaming herself for trying to bring light into a house where grief had stayed too long. Mason pressed his face into her hair and realized what his silence had taught her. He had thought he was honoring Grace by staying frozen. He had thought he was protecting Ava by keeping his heart locked away. But somehow, his little girl had learned that love was dangerous, that laughter could cause trouble, that wanting her father to be happy was something she might be punished for. "I am sorry," Mason whispered, his voice breaking. "You did nothing wrong, nothing." Ava pulled back and looked at him with wet eyes. "Then why are you scared?" Mason could not answer. Because she was right. He carried Ava back to the kitchen, one arm under her legs like he had when she was smaller. Natalie rose from the table, uncertain, but Mason shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Stay." He sat down with Ava on his lap. Grace's letter waited between them. Mason picked it up with hands that would not stop trembling. The paper felt thin and impossibly heavy. He ran his thumb over Grace's handwriting, over the curve of each letter, remembering the way she used to write grocery lists on the backs of envelopes and leave little hearts beside Ava's name. Then he opened it. The tear of paper sounded louder than the storm ever had. Mason unfolded the letter. Grace's voice seemed to rise from the page before he even began reading. She had written the way she used to speak, warm and teasing and honest enough to hurt. She told him that if he was reading this, he had probably waited too long, because he was stubborn and noble in the most annoying way. She told him she loved him for that, but she also knew him well enough to know he might turn grief into a job and call it loyalty. Mason's eyes blurred. Grace wrote that love was never meant to become a locked room. She said Ava would need laughter more than monuments, bedtime stories more than silence, and a father who remembered how to live, not just survive. She told him that if someone ever made Ava laugh again, he should not be afraid of it. He should not treat happiness like betrayal. He should not make their daughter carry the weight of his unfinished goodbye. Natalie covered her mouth with one hand. Ava leaned against Mason's chest, listening. Mason kept reading, though the words shook in his hands. Grace wrote that loving someone new would not erase the love they had. It would only prove that the love they had built was strong enough to keep giving warmth after she was gone. Then Mason reached the final lines. "And if the woman who makes our little girl laugh happens to be standing in our kitchen during a snowstorm, wearing something that clearly belongs to you, Mason Reed, try not to be impossible. Open the door. Let life come in." Mason stopped. For a long moment no one spoke. Then a sound broke out of him. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something in between. Something wounded and relieved and terrified all at once. He lowered the letter and pressed it against his chest. Then Mason Reed, who had stayed strong through hospital rooms, funeral homes, overdue notices, winter roads, and every lonely night after Grace was gone, finally cried in front of his daughter. Ava wrapped her arms around his neck. Natalie sat beside them, Grace's blue scarf trembling in her hands. And for the first time in 2 years, Mason did not feel like crying meant he was falling apart. It felt like a door opening. Here is asterisk part 7, asterisk rewritten with asterisk no heading, asterisk stronger public drama, deeper justice payoff, and more emotional Dad 1 style power. By late afternoon, Natalie Hart stopped running. She stood in Mason Reed's kitchen with Grace's blue scarf around her shoulders and the last traces of the storm melting from the windows. Ava sat at the table beside Mason, one hand still resting on the letter her mother had left behind. The cabin was quiet, but not empty anymore. Something had shifted there. Something painful had opened, and because it opened, light had found a way in. Natalie looked at Mason, then at Ava. "I cannot hide behind your door and call it courage," she said. Mason understood before she reached for her phone. "Natalie," he said carefully, You do not have to do this here. Yes, she answered. I do. Her voice did not shake. That was how Mason knew she had made the choice before she said it out loud. She called Calvin Rhodes first. He answered with the controlled urgency of a man surrounded by damage reports, board pressure, and ringing phones. Natalie did not let him manage her. I am making a live statement, she said. Calvin began to argue. Corporate headquarters would be safer. The legal team needed time. The board needed language. The press needed access. The optics needed control. Natalie closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them as someone different. No more controlled language, she said. No more prepared grief. No more men speaking for me while calling it protection. Briar Creek Community Hall. 1 hour. Calvin went silent. And Calvin, she added, if you still work for me, you will make sure the truth has a microphone before Preston gets another lie. When she hung up, Mason shook his head. This is your fight, he said, not mine. Natalie looked toward Ava, who was folding one of her drawings with careful little fingers. It became your fight when Preston walked into your home and threatened your daughter. Mason had no answer for that. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to keep Ava away from cameras, strangers, and the polished cruelty of people like Preston Vale. But Ava looked up at him and whispered, Daddy, I do not want him to say bad things about you. That settled it. An hour later, Briar Creek Community Hall glowed against the snowy evening like the only warm place left in town. The old brick building smelled of floor polish, wet coats, and coffee from a silver urn near the back wall. Folding chairs filled quickly. Local townspeople came because news traveled fast in a small place, especially when black corporate cars and a county deputy had been seen near a single father's cabin. A few reporters stood near the front with cameras. Hartwell board members appeared on large video screens mounted beside the stage. Calvin stood off to one side, tense and pale. Bianca Vale clutched her leather folder like a shield. Marlene sat near the aisle, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching Mason and Ava with worried eyes. Mason stood near the back wall. He did not want attention. He did not want pity. He did not want anyone looking at his worn coat, cracked hands, or the little girl standing beside him and deciding they understood his whole life. Ava held his hand with one hand and her drawing with the other. Natalie stood near the front, waiting. Then Preston Vale entered. He did not hurry. Men like Preston never hurried when they believed the room already belonged to them. He wore the same dark coat, the same polished smile, the same quiet confidence of a man used to turning other people's fear into his advantage. He stepped to the microphone before Natalie could. The room settled. Preston smiled gently, like he was comforting everyone. Thank you all for being here, he began. This has been a difficult and deeply personal time for Natalie. As many of you know, she has been under tremendous pressure. Out of respect for her privacy, our priority has been to protect her, support her, and guide Hartwell Horizons through this sensitive moment with dignity. Every word sounded kind. Every word took something from her. Mason saw Natalie's fingers curl at her sides. Preston continued, his voice smooth as glass. There has been confusion. There has been speculation. But Natalie has people around her who care deeply and who are prepared to help her return to stability. Mason felt Ava's hand tighten. Natalie stepped forward. Enough. The word was not loud, but it cut clean through the room. Preston turned, still smiling. Natalie, this is not the time. It is exactly the time. She took the microphone from its stand. For a moment she looked out at everyone. The townspeople, the cameras, the board members glowing coldly from their screens, the employees who had spent years seeing her as a title before a person. Then her eyes found Mason and Ava near the back. She breathed in. I was never engaged to Preston Vale, Natalie said. A ripple moved through the hall. Preston's smile stiffened. Natalie kept going. I did not agree to marry him. I did not approve the public announcement. I did not authorize any statement suggesting I suffered a breakdown. I left because my silence was being used as consent, and my life was being treated like a contract clause. Cameras shifted. Someone whispered near the front row. Preston stepped closer. Natalie, I understand you are emotional. No, she said, turning to him. You understand that if you call a woman emotional loudly enough, people stop listening to what she is saying. The room went still. Mason saw Calvin lower his eyes. Natalie faced the crowd again. Hartwell Horizons was built on the promise of creating places where people belong. But I let my own company become a place where image mattered more than truth. I let people around me turn my name into property. That ends tonight. Preston's face hardened now. The charm began to crack around the edges. He pointed toward the back of the room, toward Mason. And what about him? Preston asked, louder now. A struggling mechanic who found you in a storm and suddenly became part of your story. Are we supposed to believe he wanted nothing? That he did not exploit a vulnerable moment? Mason felt every eye turn. Heat rose in his neck. He looked down at Ava, ready to leave, ready to shield her from the humiliation before it could touch her. But Natalie's voice stopped him. Mason Reed pulled me from a wrecked SUV without knowing my name, she said. He brought me into his home because leaving me outside would have been wrong. He gave me shelter, dry clothes, and dignity. He asked for nothing. Preston gave a cold laugh. Men like that always ask eventually. Natalie looked directly at him. You offered him money to disappear. The room shifted. Mason heard someone gasp. Preston's eyes flashed toward Calvin. Natalie continued. He refused it. Calvin slowly stepped forward. His face looked older than it had that morning. That is true, Calvin said. Preston turned on him. Calvin. But Calvin did not retreat. It is also true, Calvin added, that draft statements regarding the engagement were prepared before Ms. Hart gave consent. The release about her emotional state was circulated without her approval. Bianca's face drained of color. Natalie looked at her. Bianca? The public relations manager gripped her folder tighter. For a moment, she looked at Preston, then at Natalie, then at the cameras. Whatever loyalty had kept her silent seemed to collapse under the weight of being seen. The engagement language was prepared in advance, Bianca admitted. Preston's team pushed it. We were told Miss Hart would fall in line once the announcement went public. Now the room truly changed. People were no longer watching a powerful woman being rescued from embarrassment. They were watching a lie come apart in front of them. Preston's polished mask finally slipped. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You are letting a broke mechanic and his child turn a corporate matter into a small-town morality play. Mason flinched, not for himself, but because Ava heard it. Preston pointed toward him. He got lucky in a snowstorm. That is all. Before Mason could stop her, Ava let go of his hand. She walked down the aisle with her drawing held against her chest. The hall seemed to hold its breath as the little girl stepped into the space between wealth and truth, between a powerful man's insult and her father's quiet dignity. Mason whispered, Ava. But she did not stop. She stood near Natalie, small beneath the lights, her voice trembling but clear. My daddy is not lucky, she said. He is good. No one moved. Ava lifted the drawing. It showed the cabin, the storm, Mason pulling Natalie from the snow, and a little girl standing in the doorway with the yellow light behind her. He fixes cars, Ava said, and doors, and heaters, and my bad dreams. He did not save her because she was rich. He saved her because that is what Daddy does." Mason's eyes burned. Marlene covered her mouth with one hand. Natalie knelt beside Ava, not caring about the cameras, the board, or the shocked silence in the room. "I am sorry," Natalie said softly, though the microphone carried every word. "I'm sorry my world came into your home and made you afraid. I'm sorry I almost left without being brave." Ava looked at her. "Are you brave now?" Natalie smiled through tears. "I am trying to be." Then Natalie stood again. She faced Preston, the board screens, the cameras, and every person who had mistaken her silence for weakness. "As of tonight," she said, "Hartwell Horizons is pausing all Vail partnership negotiations. An independent review will begin immediately into unauthorized public statements, board pressure, and any attempt to use my personal life for corporate gain." Preston went pale with rage. Natalie did not look away. "My life is not a merger," she said. "My heart is not a press release, and my future will not be chosen by anyone who thinks love can be arranged like a business deal." The room erupted. Not loudly at first. It began with one clap from somewhere near the back, then another, then another. Soon the hall filled with applause that sounded less like celebration and more like release. Mason stood frozen, Ava's empty hand still warm in his palm. For so long, he had believed men like him only survived by staying quiet, by keeping their heads down, by letting richer people speak first and louder. But tonight, Mason Reed was not saved by money. He was defended by truth. Marlene watched Ava run back to her father and wrap both arms around his waist. She saw the way Mason bent over her, protective but not broken. She saw the way Ava looked at him, not like a child clinging to something unstable, but like a daughter standing beside the safest place she knew. And in Marlene's eyes, the fear finally softened into understanding. Ava did not need to be taken from Mason. She needed the world to stop confusing struggle with failure. She needed people to stop underestimating the love that had been holding her together all along. Natalie stepped down from the stage and walked toward Mason. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many people, too many cameras, too much history still trembling between them. Then Natalie looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You gave me a place to choose," she said. Mason looked down at Ava, then back at Natalie. "No," he said quietly. "Ava did." Ava reached out and took Natalie's hand. And in the middle of that crowded hall, beneath old lights and falling snow outside the windows, 3 people stood together while the lie that had chased Natalie into the storm finally lost its power. Here is Part 8, rewritten, with no heading, stronger emotional closure, realistic life shift, and warm Dad 1 style pacing. The days after the community hall did not turn Mason Reed's life into a fairy tale. The rent was still late. The cabin roof still leaked near the back porch. The truck still made that tired, grinding sound whenever the morning was too cold. Ava still woke from bad dreams some nights and reached for the stuffed rabbit her mother had left behind. But something in the house had changed. It was not perfect. It was lighter. For the first time in years, Mason woke up without feeling like the whole world was already sitting on his chest before his feet touched the floor. The problems were still there, but they no longer felt like proof that he was failing. They felt like things he could face one at a time. In the world beyond Briar Creek, Preston Vale's polished empire began to crack. The board of Hartwell Horizons moved quickly to distance itself from him. The independent review Natalie demanded uncovered more than one unauthorized statement, more than one pressure campaign, and more than one person who had treated her silence like permission. Preston's family tried to control the damage, but this time the story had already escaped their hands. Natalie stayed chief executive officer, but not as the woman she had been before. She stopped letting lawyers soften her truth before she said it. She stopped allowing handlers to stand between her and her own life. She replaced people who had protected Preston's influence over her well-being. Calvin kept his position only after admitting his failure publicly and agreeing to answer directly to Natalie's new ethics committee. Bianca resigned quietly before the review was complete. For the first time in a long time, Natalie was not being managed. She was leading. Back in Briar Creek, Mason returned to Harlan's Auto Repair expecting whispers. He expected people to stare at him like the poor mechanic who had somehow gotten tangled in a rich woman's scandal. He expected questions he did not want to answer. He expected judgment dressed up as curiosity. Instead, the first customer through the door was old Mr. Tully, who had driven his rusted pickup in with nothing wrong except a loose windshield wiper. When Mason told him it would take 5 minutes, Mr. Tully shrugged and said, "Then take 10. I came to shake your hand anyway." By lunch, 3 more people had done the same. A school bus driver brought muffins from her sister's bakery. A rancher asked Mason to look over his truck and then told him Ava had a brave little heart. Even the deputy who had come to the cabin with Preston stopped by, took off his hat, and apologized for not asking more questions before following a rich man's version of concern. Mason accepted the apology quietly. He was not a man who needed people to kneel for him. He just needed them to see him clearly. Harlan waited until the shop was almost empty before calling Mason into the office. The old man looked uncomfortable, rubbing the back of his neck like the words were stuck somewhere between pride and shame. "I should have trusted you," Harlan said. Mason did not answer right away. Harlan sighed. "I heard one side of things and let pressure make me stupid. Your hours are back, full schedule. And if you want extra work on the weekend, it is yours." Mason looked at him, tired but steady. "I do not want pity." "I know. I want fair work for fair pay." Harlan nodded. "Then that is what you will get." That mattered more than any gift could have. Because Mason did not want to be rescued from effort, he wanted the chance to stand without someone kicking his knees out from under him. A few evenings later, Marlene came to the cabin. She brought a casserole wrapped in foil, which was her way of apologizing before she was ready to say the words. Mason let her in. Ava watched carefully from the table, pretending to draw while listening to every breath the adults took. Marlene placed the dish on the counter and looked around the small room. The repair generator hummed outside. Grace's blue scarf was folded neatly on the back of a chair. The cedar memory box sat on the shelf now, no longer hidden in the closet. Marlene's eyes filled when she saw it. "I was scared," she said. Mason leaned against the counter. "I know, I let scared sound like accusation." He looked down. That one landed softly but deep. Marlene turned toward Ava. "And I should never have made you feel like home could be taken away because you told the truth." Ava's pencil stopped moving. "Am I staying with Daddy?" she asked. Marlene's face broke a little. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "You are staying with your daddy." Ava ran to Mason and wrapped herself around his leg. Mason looked at Marlene over the top of his daughter's head. He did not say everything was fine. It was not. Fear had done damage. Words had left marks. But family, he was learning, could not heal if everyone pretended they had never been wounded. So he nodded, and Marlene nodded back. Natalie did not return with diamonds, cameras, or a check big enough to embarrass him. That was how Mason knew she had been listening. Instead, she came to Harlan's garage one afternoon wearing boots instead of heels, her hair pulled back, no assistant hovering behind her. Mason was under the hood of a delivery van when she walked in. For a moment, every mechanic in the shop went quiet. Natalie ignored the attention and waited until Mason wiped his hands on a rag. "I have a project," she said. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Sounds expensive." "It is," she said, "but not in the way you think." Hartwell Horizons owned an abandoned roadside lodge outside Briar Creek, a place that had once served travelers before the highway changed routes. Natalie wanted to turn it into a family shelter and emergency winter stop for stranded drivers, single parents, and people who needed a safe place during mountain storms. Not luxury, shelter, real shelter. She wanted Mason to consult on the design. He almost laughed because the idea sounded too big for him. "I fix engines, Natalie. I do not design buildings." "You know what safety feels like when there is no money to fake it," she said. "You know where generators fail, where doors need to seal, where scared kids should sit. What a father needs when he walks in carrying more fear than luggage. My designers know beauty. You know survival. I need both." Mason looked away because the respect in her voice was harder to accept than charity would have been. "How much does it pay?" he asked finally. Natalie smiled faintly. "Fairly. Not special because of Ava? No. Not because you feel guilty? No. Because I know what I am talking about." "Yes, Mason. Because you know what you are talking about." So he accepted. The work changed things slowly, in ways that felt real. Mason caught up on rent. He replaced the broken cabinet hinge. He bought proper sealant for the leaking roof instead of patching it with whatever he had left in the shed. He put a little money aside, not much, but enough that the future no longer felt like a locked door. More than money, the work gave him something. Grief and poverty had taken from him. Dignity that other people could see. Ava changed too, not all at once. Healing did not work like a light switch. But she laughed more often. She sang quietly in the bathtub again, sometimes forgetting to stop when Mason passed the door. Her drawings began to fill with faces. Not perfect ones, not always smiling, but complete. She drew the cabin with smoke coming from the chimney. She drew Buck wearing a crown. She drew Mason fixing a generator while Natalie held the flashlight wrong. And in the corner of one picture, she drew a small blue scarf wrapped around a yellow sun. One evening, Natalie came to the cabin with that scarf folded carefully in her hands. "I wanted to return this," she said. Ava looked up from the table. "Did it help?" Natalie knelt in front of her. "More than you know." Ava thought about that, then touched the soft edge of the fabric. "Mommy would not mind if you wore it sometimes," she said. The room went quiet. Mason looked toward the window because he needed a second to breathe. Natalie pressed the scarf to her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Nothing between Mason and Natalie rushed after that. There were no grand speeches beneath flashing cameras, no sudden promises, no pretending that grief could be replaced by romance or that one brave night could solve every wound. They moved carefully, honestly, with Ava's heart at the center of every step. Sometimes Natalie stayed for dinner. Sometimes Mason helped at the lodge site and came home smelling like sawdust instead of motor oil. Sometimes Ava asked Natalie questions only a child would ask, like whether lonely people became less lonely when they told the truth, or whether buildings could feel happy if the right people walked inside them. Natalie always answered like the questions mattered, and Mason watched. He watched Ava reach for Natalie's hand without fear. He watched Natalie listen to stories about grace without trying to compete with a memory. He watched his home become warmer, not because the past had disappeared, but because the future had finally been allowed to enter. Mason understood now. Loving again did not erase grace. It honored the life she had begged him not to stop living. And Natalie understood something too. Belonging could not be bought, announced, branded, or built with polished wood and expensive stone. It had to be earned in quiet places, at a kitchen table, beside a child's drawing, in a small cabin outside Briar Creek, where a broken-hearted father had once opened the door during a snowstorm and accidentally let life come back inside. Here is Part 9 rewritten with no heading, warmer emotion, stronger closing lines, and a smooth Dad One-style outro. That night, the cabin was quiet in a way Mason Reed had almost forgotten home could be. No wind screamed through the trees. No headlights crawled up the driveway. No lawyers stood on the porch with polished threats hidden behind polite smiles. Outside, snow rested gently on the roof and along the pine branches, soft and silver beneath the moonlight. Inside, the repaired furnace hummed steadily, and a pot of hot chocolate warmed on the stove, filling the kitchen with the sweet smell of cocoa. Mason sat at the table with Ava beside him, helping her cut paper snowflakes from folded white paper. His hands were too rough for delicate edges, and every snowflake he made came out crooked. But Ava said crooked ones were special because they looked like they had survived something. Buck slept near the fire, one paw twitching as if he was chasing rabbits through a warmer dream. Natalie sat across from them, sleeves rolled up, trying carefully to copy Ava's folding pattern. She was not Natalie Hart, famous chief executive officer. Not a headline. Not a woman being pushed toward a life she never chose. Not someone running from cameras, contracts, or Preston Vale's shadow. Tonight, she was simply Natalie. A woman invited to dinner. A woman trusted with scissors, hot chocolate, and a child's laughter. Ava climbed onto a chair and taped one paper snowflake to the window. Behind it, she had placed a new drawing. Mason noticed it only when the firelight caught the colors. The picture showed the cabin under tall pine trees. Smoke rose from the chimney. Buck lay on the porch. Mason stood beside Ava, and Natalie stood on Ava's other side. All three of them were holding hands. Above them, near the corner of the sky, Ava had drawn a small golden light. Mason's throat tightened. "What is that, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Ava looked at the drawing, then back at him. "That's Mommy," she said. Mason went still. Ava touched the golden light with one tiny finger. "She's watching, but not because she's sad." Natalie's eyes filled. Mason could barely speak. "Then why?" Ava smiled, small but sure. "Because we're okay." For a long moment, Mason just looked at the picture. The grief was still there. He knew it always would be. Grace would always be part of the walls, the photographs, the cedar box, the songs Ava half remembered, and the love that had shaped him into the father he became. But grief no longer felt like a locked room. It felt like a light left on, a love strong enough to make space for more love. Under the table, Natalie reached for Mason's hand. She did not rush him. She did not pull. She simply offered. And this time, Mason let his fingers close around hers. No one made a promise too big for the moment. No one pretended the road ahead would be easy. There would still be bills, storms, hard mornings, and memories that hurt when they arrived without warning. But the house felt warmer than it had in years. Ava laughed as Buck woke up with a snort and bumped his nose against a fallen snowflake. Natalie laughed too, soft and surprised, like happiness was something she was still learning how to hold. Mason looked at them both and felt something inside him finally loosen. Sometimes rescue did not happen all at once. Sometimes a man pulled a stranger from a snowstorm, never knowing she would help pull him from the winter he had been carrying inside. Sometimes a little girl told her mother's secret, and that secret opened a door everyone else had been too afraid to touch. And sometimes love did not replace what was lost. It simply reminded the living that they were still allowed to come home. If this story touched you, subscribe to Just Dad Things for more single dad stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.